In 1961, Audrey Hepburn stepped out of a yellow taxi on Fifth Avenue in a black Givenchy gown and became Holly Golightly, one of the most iconic characters in the history of cinema. But that role was never meant for her. The man who wrote Holly Golightly wanted someone else. He fought for someone else. He practically begged the studio for someone else. And when he didn't get his way, he said publicly that Audrey's casting made him want to throw up. The woman he wanted was Marilyn Monroe. What most people don't know is what happened between these two women, what Audrey felt watching Marilyn be passed over, what she felt after Marilyn died, and what she finally said, years later, about a role that had never been meant for her at all. That sentence, quiet, unprompted, spoken to no one in particular, would leave the people who heard it completely speechless. Because it wasn't what they expected from the woman who had won the role. It was the opposite. 1958 Truman Capote was 44 years old, famously difficult, famously brilliant, and famously devoted to the characters he created. Holly Golightly, the heroine of his novella Breakfast at Tiffany's, was his favorite. He had said so publicly, more than once. Holly was his greatest creation, and he had written her with a specific face in mind. Not dark-eyed. Not precise. Not trained in ballet. Blonde. Wild. Wounded underneath the laughter. Marilyn Monroe. Capote and Marilyn had been friends for years. He had watched her up close, watched the way she moved through a room, the way she charmed everyone and trusted no one, the way she constructed a persona of radiant, breathless happiness over something far more complicated underneath. He recognized in her the same architecture he had built into Holly. A woman who seemed to belong nowhere, who had invented herself from nothing, who laughed at the right moments because laughing was easier than explaining what was actually there. Holly Golightly had grown up in rural Texas as Lula Mae Barnes, married off at 14, survived on her own terms by the time she reached New York. Marilyn Monroe had grown up as Norma Jean, passed between foster homes, shaped by men who wanted something from her before she knew how to want anything for herself. The parallels were not subtle. Capote knew it. Marilyn knew it. When Capote's novella was published and she read it, she reportedly called him and said very little. She didn't need to. He already knew. When Paramount acquired the rights and began developing the screenplay, Capote made his position clear from the first conversation: Marilyn was Holly. Not a version of Holly. Not someone who could approximate Holly. Holly herself, walking into frame. The screenwriter, George Axelrod, was hired specifically to tailor the script for her. That was the assignment. Not to adapt the novella for a general actress, but to shape it around Marilyn's particular strengths, her rhythm, her presence, the specific quality of vulnerability she carried. Axelrod understood. He began writing with her voice in his ear. For a brief period, it seemed as though it would happen. Then it didn't. The reason Marilyn Monroe did not play Holly Golightly is, on its surface, simple. She was advised not to. Lee Strasberg, the director of the Actors Studio, the man Marilyn trusted perhaps more than anyone in her professional life, told her that playing Holly would damage her image. Holly Golightly was, underneath the elegance and the wit, essentially an escort. A woman who accepted money from men for her company, for her time, for whatever the arrangement required. In Capote's novella this was not softened. Holly was, as Capote later said, a tough character, real, complex, not designed to be loved without reservation. Strasberg's concern was not artistic. It was strategic. Marilyn had spent years fighting to be taken seriously as an actress, and playing a woman of Holly's particular profession might undo what she had built. The public image, the innocence, the warmth, the sense that she was somehow both knowing and untouched, might not survive it. Marilyn listened. She chose The Misfits instead, a film written specifically for her by Arthur Miller, directed by John Huston, co-starring Clark Gable. It was the last film she would complete before her death. Whether she regretted passing on Holly Golightly, she never said directly. But in 1962, after Breakfast at Tiffany's had been released and had become the cultural phenomenon it became, she was photographed by Bert Stern for Vogue. In one sequence of images, she wore a long black gown, her blonde hair loose, her expression caught in something between amusement and longing. The images looked, to everyone who saw them, like what a Marilyn Monroe Holly Golightly might have been. No one said this to her directly. But the photographs were taken. She chose to be photographed that way. She died 6 weeks after that session. She was 36 years old. Audrey Hepburn was not the studio's second choice, or their third. Her name had been in conversations about the project since early 1959, before Marilyn had formally declined, before Shirley MacLaine had turned it down, before Kim Novak had passed. But the decision to formally offer the role to Audrey did not come until Paramount had exhausted the options Capote preferred. Audrey knew this. She was not naive about how the industry worked, and she was not naive about what Capote thought of her casting. His opinion was not private. He made it available to anyone who asked. She also had her own reservations. Holly Golightly was an extrovert of a very particular kind, loud, impulsive, filling rooms with noise and color, and the kind of social performance that costs nothing because it comes naturally. Audrey was the opposite. She was precise, contained, guarded in the way of someone who had learned early that exposure was expensive. She was an introvert who had spent her career managing the distance between herself and the characters she played. With Holly, there was almost no distance to manage. Holly went toward everything. Audrey's instinct was to step back. She said as much to Blake Edwards when they first spoke about the project. She told him she wasn't sure she could do it. She told him Holly's energy was not her energy, Holly's approach to the world was not her approach, and she was concerned that what she would bring to the role would be something quieter and more interior than what Capote had written. Edwards told her to bring exactly that. He had a theory about Holly that differed from Capote's. He believed the most interesting version of the character was not the version Capote had written, rough, defiant, unapologetically self-constructed, but the version that existed underneath that performance. The loneliness. The fear. The way the laughter was a kind of armor. Edwards believed Audrey could find that version. He believed, in fact, that she was the only person in Hollywood who could. She agreed to do it. Principal photography began on October 2, 1960, on Fifth Avenue in New York City, outside the Tiffany & Company flagship store. Audrey stood in the pale morning light in a black Givenchy gown, holding a paper cup of coffee and a paper bag of pastries, and stared into a jewelry store window. She had been awake since 4 in the morning. She was 31 years old. She was, by almost any measure, the wrong person for this role. The camera rolled. She turned slightly. And something happened in her face, a quality of wanting that was also a quality of not quite belonging, that had not been in the script, that could not have been planned, that was simply there. The crew saw it. Edward saw it. And everyone who would later watch that opening sequence, that lone woman on an empty Fifth Avenue at dawn, holding coffee in front of a window full of diamonds she would never own, would feel it without knowing what it was. The film opened on October 5, 1961. Audrey Hepburn's performance was called, by nearly every major critic, one of the finest of her career. The film was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Actress for Audrey. It won 2, Best Original Score and Best Original Song, for Henry Mancini's Moon River. Truman Capote did not celebrate. He gave interviews. He was asked about the film. He was asked about Audrey's performance. He was asked, repeatedly, whether he had changed his mind. He had not. It was the most miscast film I've ever seen, he said, toward the end of his life. It made me want to throw up. He acknowledged, when pressed, that he was fond of Audrey personally. He did not retract that fondness. But he was equally clear that fondness and correctness were separate things, and the casting had not been correct. Holly was real, a tough character, not an Audrey Hepburn type at all. The film had become, in his words, a mawkish Valentine to New York City, thin and pretty, whereas it should have been rich and ugly. Marilyn was always my first choice to play the girl, Holly Golightly, he said. She had exactly the right mix of experience and vulnerability for the role. These were not private observations. They were published. They circulated. They found Audrey. She did not respond publicly. She did not respond privately through intermediaries or press agents or carefully worded statements. She absorbed what Capote had said and she said nothing. People who knew her assumed this was professional discretion. A woman of her stature did not get into arguments with difficult men. She had learned this early and practiced it throughout her career. But those who were close to her during this period said it was something more than discretion. It was something closer to agreement. Marilyn Monroe died on the morning of August 5, 1962, at her home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. She was 36 years old. The cause was acute barbiturate poisoning. The circumstances were never fully resolved. Audrey was in Europe when she heard. She had been living in Switzerland with her husband Mel Ferrer and their son Sean, who was 2 years old. A friend called her with the news. She said almost nothing in response. She thanked the person who called and ended the conversation. Later that day, she went for a long walk alone. She had not been close to Marilyn in the way that implied regular contact, shared confidences, the texture of an ongoing friendship. They had moved in overlapping circles, the same industry, the same era, the same pressures and absurdities and particular loneliness that came with being a woman at that level of fame in that decade. They had met at events. They had spoken. They were not strangers. But what Audrey felt that afternoon was not the grief of losing someone she had known intimately. It was something harder to name. A recognition, maybe. A sense of something being permanently closed that had always been left slightly open, the question of what Marilyn might have done next, who she might have become, what the remaining decades of her life might have looked like. Marilyn had been 36. Audrey was 33. That evening, Audrey sat down and wrote a letter. She wrote it by hand, as she always wrote important things. The letter was addressed to no one in particular. It was not sent. It was found among her personal papers years later by her son Sean, and he has described its contents only in the broadest terms, that it was a letter about loss, about the specific cruelty of a life cut short, about the distance between a woman's public image and whatever was actually happening inside her. Sean has said it was one of the saddest things his mother ever wrote. He has also said it was written with very little sentimentality. Audrey. In the years after Breakfast at Tiffany's, Audrey was asked about the film many times. She was asked about the Givenchy gown. She was asked about Moon River, whether she had known the song would become what it became, whether she had understood in the moment of filming the fire escape scene, her legs folded beneath her, her guitar resting on her knee, that something permanent was being made. She was occasionally asked about Capote. About his statements. About whether she thought he was right. She deflected those questions. She said she understood his disappointment. She said she had great respect for the source material and for its author. She said she had done her best with what she had been given and that audiences had been generous with her. She did not say whether she thought she had been the right choice. This restraint was noticed. It was read, by some, as humility. By others, as the carefully maintained silence of someone who had survived a hostile reception and did not want to provoke further comment. Neither reading was quite right. The truth was that Audrey had been thinking about Marilyn and Holly Golightly for years, not obsessively, not in a way that disturbed her, but steadily, the way you think about a question that doesn't have a clean answer. She had read what Capote said. She had understood what he meant. She had, in the privacy of her own assessment, considered whether he was correct. And she had arrived, slowly and without announcing it, at something she believed. It was sometime in the late 1980s. Audrey was in her 60s. She had long since stepped back from acting and devoted most of her time to her work with UNICEF, traveling to famine zones, to refugee camps, to places where the scale of suffering was so large that the whole previous architecture of her life, the films and the gowns and the fame, seemed to belong to someone else. She was at a small dinner. The guests included a few people from the industry, a journalist she had known for years, a friend from her earlier life in Rome. The conversation had moved, as conversations at those dinners sometimes did, through various decades and projects and memories. Someone mentioned breakfast at Tiffany's. It came up naturally, not as a provocation, simply as part of the chronology of her life being discussed. Someone else, the journalist, or perhaps one of the others, the accounts differ slightly, mentioned Marilyn. Mentioned the casting history. Mentioned what Capote had always said. There was a brief pause. And then Audrey said it. Quietly. Without drama. In the tone of someone stating something she had thought about for a long time and had simply never said out loud before. I played Holly Golightly, but Marilyn would have understood her better than I ever could. The table went still. The journalist, who was present, later said it was the most unexpected thing she had ever heard from Audrey Hepburn. Not because it was self-deprecating, Audrey was capable of self-deprecation, but because of its precision. She wasn't saying she had done a poor job. She wasn't apologizing for the role or for having taken it. She was making a specific claim about the nature of understanding, about the difference between performing a character and living close enough to her truth that the performance becomes something else entirely. She was saying that Marilyn had that proximity. That she herself had not. No one at the table said anything for a moment. Then someone asked her what she may. Sean Ferrer has spoken about his mother in interviews over the years with a combination of precision and protectiveness that reflects, unmistakably, something she passed down to him. He speaks carefully. He does not embellish. He says what he knows and does not say more. When asked about his mother's feelings regarding Marilyn Monroe, he has been consistent. He has said that she admired Marilyn in a way that was not typical of how one famous woman admires another. It was not competitive admiration, not the kind of professional respect that is really a form of measured comparison. It was something more direct. She thought Marilyn was genuinely extraordinary, not as a symbol or an icon, but as an actress. She thought Marilyn's best work was underestimated because it arrived in the wrong packaging, because the way Marilyn looked and moved made it easy for critics to see surface rather than depth. She talked about Some Like It Hot. She talked about Bus Stop. She talked about The Misfits, the last film Marilyn completed, and said she thought it contained some of the most honest acting she had ever seen on screen. She did not, Sean has said, talk about these films competitively. She talked about them the way you talk about things that genuinely move you. He has also said that after Marilyn died, his mother kept a photograph. Not a famous photograph. Not the subway grate, not the white dress, not any of the images that had become mythology. A small, informal photograph from a set, Marilyn mid-laugh, off guard, clearly not performing. Audrey kept it in a drawer. Not displayed. Not hidden. Just kept. Sean found it after his mother died, in January 1993. He kept it. He has said he doesn't entirely know why his mother had it, what it represented to her, what she thought about when she looked at it. But he has one theory. He thinks his mother kept it as a reminder. Not of Marilyn specifically, or not only of Marilyn, but of something the photograph captured, what it looks like when a person is entirely present, entirely themselves, with no distance between what they feel and what shows on their face. My mother spent her whole career trying to achieve that, Sean has said. She thought Marilyn did it naturally. She respected that more than almost anything.